It began on the night the wind forgot how to breathe and the forest learned how to listen. Jacob Mercer had lived his entire life between the furrows of his family's farm in southeastern Kentucky, where the hills rolled like frozen waves and the nights came heavy with silence. But that particular October evening carried something different in its bones, something that made the dogs refuse to leave the porch and the cattle huddle close in the western pasture. He was 53 years old, with hands scarred from honest labor and a heart still tender from his wife's passing. 3 winters prior, a man whose faith had once been as solid as the oak beams in his barn, but had grown thin and brittle like old paper left too long in the sun. The invitation had come in the strangest way, not through a letter or a phone call, but through a knowing, a pull in his chest that had grown stronger with each passing day, until he found himself standing at the edge of his property at midnight, with a flashlight he knew he wouldn't need, and a Bible tucked into his jacket pocket, though he couldn't remember placing it there. Beyond the fence line, the woods stretched dark and deep, an ancient tract of land, where his grandfather once claimed to have seen lights that danced between the trees, and where Jacob himself, as a boy, had felt the peculiar sensation of being watched by something that held no malice, only curiosity. He climbed over the split-rail fence, his boots finding purchase on ground carpeted with pine needles, and began walking not because he chose to, but because something older than choice was leading him forward step by step into a darkness that somehow felt less frightening than the emptiness he'd been carrying inside himself for far too long. The forest accepted him without resistance, and as he moved deeper between the towering pines and silent oaks, he became aware that he was not alone, that other footsteps were converging from different directions, other souls being drawn by the same inexplicable gravity toward a destination none of them fully understood. The first one he saw was a woman, perhaps 40 years old, wearing a waitress uniform with a name tag that read Sandra, and eyes that carried the same mixture of fear and wonder that Jacob felt pulsing in his own chest. They exchanged no words, but fell into step together, their flashlights creating small islands of illumination in an ocean of darkness, and soon others joined them, a mechanic still wearing his oil-stained coveralls, a young man who looked like he'd just gotten off a night shift somewhere, a grandmother clutching a rosary in her weathered hands, each of them moving forward, as if following a song only their souls could hear. The forest grew denser, and the darkness more complete, yet none of them stumbled, as if the path itself was guiding their feet. And then, without warning, they emerged into a clearing Jacob had never seen before, though he'd hunted these woods for 40 years, a perfect circle of open ground perhaps 50 yards across, where the canopy opened to reveal a sky absolutely drowning in stars, more stars than should have been visible, more stars than the human eye was meant to comprehend, stars that seemed close enough to touch and so bright they cast actual shadows on the forest floor. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied easy description, not quite a building and not quite a craft, something that seemed to exist at the intersection of geometry and light, its surface rippling like mercury one moment and solid as stone the next, emanating a soft luminescence that felt warm and welcoming and utterly impossible. Around this structure, perhaps 24 people had already gathered, standing in loose clusters, speaking in hushed voices, or simply staring upward at the impossible sky, their faces painted with wonder and disbelief, and something that looked almost like recognition, as if they were remembering something they'd forgotten long ago. Jacob felt Sandra's hand slip into his, and he squeezed it gently, a wordless acknowledgement that they were sharing something profound, something that would divide their lives into before and after. And then the structure began to change its light, intensifying its surface, becoming translucent, and through that translucence they could see movement shapes that were almost human, but not quite, beings of light and shadow, and something that existed beyond both. The forest held its breath, and so did Jacob, and so did everyone in that clearing as the first of the beings emerged, stepping through the structure's wall as if passing through water, its form tall and slender, wrapped in robes that seemed woven from starlight itself, its face hidden yet somehow conveying a sense of infinite gentleness, infinite patience, infinite age. More of them came, 6, then 7, then 8, moving with a grace that suggested they experienced gravity differently, arranging themselves in a semicircle facing the gathered humans, and in that moment, Jacob understood with a clarity that pierced straight through his doubt that everything he'd been taught in Sunday school, every story he'd dismissed as metaphor, every miracle he'd explained away as myth, had been preparation for this, for the understanding that heaven had never been a place above the Clouds, but something woven into the very fabric of existence, something that certain souls could touch when the barriers between worlds grew thin. The tallest of the beings raised one long, elegant hand, and though it spoke no words, Jacob heard a voice not in his ears, but in the center of his chest, in the place where grief and hope had been waging their silent war, and the voice said without sound, without language, that they had been called here not by accident, but by readiness, by a soul's capacity to hold mystery, without demanding explanation, to experience wonder, without insisting on proof. Dad told them that what they were about to witness would change them, irrevocably would plant seeds of understanding that would take years to fully bloom, but that the transformation had already begun the moment they'd felt that first pull, that first invitation echoing in their bones. Jacob felt tears streaming down his face, though he couldn't have said whether they were tears of joy or sorrow, or some emotion that existed beyond the reach of words, and when he looked around the clearing, he saw his own tears reflected in every face. The grandmother with her rosary was weeping silently. The young man had fallen to his knees. The mechanic stood with his arms wrapped around himself as if trying to hold together a self that was coming undone. The beings moved among them now, not touching, but coming close enough that Jacob could feel the warmth radiating from their presence, could smell something like ozone and honey and freshly turned earth, and when one of them stopped before him, Jacob looked into what he thought was its face and saw not features, but light, pure, crystalline light that somehow held more compassion than any human expression he'd ever witnessed. In that light he saw his wife, not as she'd been in those final pain-racked days, but radiant and whole and young, and he understood with devastating certainty that death was not an ending, but a transformation, not a goodbye, but a different kind of hello, and that the grief he'd been carrying was necessary, was the price paid for having loved someone so completely that their absence left a void shaped exactly like their presence. The being before him extended its hand palm upward, and in that palm appeared an image, no a memory, no something that was both, and neither simultaneously. Jacob saw himself as a boy of 7, standing in his grandfather's church during a revival meeting, feeling for the first time that sensation of something vast and loving pressing against the boundaries of his small self, saw himself at 19 proposing to Sarah under an oak tree that still stood in his front yard, saw himself holding his newborn daughter, saw himself weeping at her funeral. When cancer took her at 23, saw himself burying Sarah, saw himself standing alone in his farmhouse, wondering if faith was just a story people told themselves to make the darkness bearable. And then the being showed him something else, showed him how every moment of joy and every moment of sorrow had been braiding together into something stronger than either could be alone, showed him how suffering refined the soul, the way fire refines gold, showed him that his doubt had not been a failure of faith, but faith's deepest expression. The willingness to believe, not because belief came easily, but because something in him refused to surrender to despair, even when despair seemed like the only rational response. The being's hand closed, and the visions faded, and Jacob found himself gasping as if he'd been underwater, as if he'd been drowning, and had just broken through to air, and the being's voice in his chest said that he and everyone gathered here had been chosen not because they were special, but because they were ready to carry a message back into the world, a message that couldn't be spoken, only lived, that the separation between heaven and earth, between spirit and flesh, between the divine and the mundane had always been an illusion, that the kingdom of God was not coming someday, but was here now, had always been here, woven into every act of kindness, every moment of beauty, every instance when a human soul reached beyond itself towards something greater. The being told him that the one they called Jesus had been trying to teach this, had been showing through his life and death, and rising that the boundary between human and divine was permeable, that transformation was always possible, that resurrection happened not once 2,000 years ago, but every time a heart broke open and chose love over fear, chose faith over certainty, chose to believe that the universe was not indifferent, but alive and aware, and moving always toward redemption. Jacob felt his knees weaken, and he sank to the ground. His hands pressed flat against the earth, and he felt the planet spinning beneath him, felt the ancient stone at its core, felt the mycelium networks threading through the soil, felt the roots of 10,000 trees drinking deep, felt the groundwater moving in slow rivers through limestone, felt the bones of his ancestors returning to dust and feeding the grass that fed the cattle that fed his family, and he understood that resurrection was not about bodies climbing out of graves, but about the endless cycle of transformation, about how nothing was ever truly lost, only changed, moved from one form to another, life to death to life again. The other beings were moving among the other people now, and Jacob could see similar transformations occurring. Faces that had been tight with fear or grief or confusion were opening, like flowers were being flooded with light from within, and he knew that each person was receiving exactly what they needed, to hear exactly what their particular wounds required for healing, that the universe was not offering generic comfort, but specific, tailored, perfectly individual grace. Time moved strangely in that clearing, seconds stretching into hours, or perhaps hours compressing into seconds. Jacob couldn't tell and didn't care, because for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt fully present, fully alive, anchored not to the past or the future, but to this moment, this impossible, beautiful, terrifying moment, when everything he thought he knew was being gently dismantled and rebuilt into something stronger, something truer. The tallest being returned to the center of the clearing and raised both hands, and suddenly the structure behind it blazed with light so intense that everyone had to shield their eyes, and in that light, Jacob saw not with his eyes, but with something deeper, saw a vision of the earth as it truly was, not a ball of rock spinning through void, but a living, breathing, conscious thing, a jewel of impossible value held in hands too vast to comprehend, saw humanity not as fallen or broken, but as children, still learning, still growing, still discovering what they were capable of becoming, saw that every act of cruelty and every act of compassion was being recorded not in some ledger of judgment, but in the very fabric of reality itself, weaving together into a story whose ending had not yet been written. And then he saw that humanity was not alone in the universe, had never been alone, that the cosmos was teeming with life, with consciousness, with civilizations both young and ancient, and that many of them had been waiting for humanity to reach a certain threshold of awareness, a certain capacity for understanding, before making contact, before revealing themselves, before offering guidance, not to save humanity from itself, but to welcome it into a larger community, a cosmic family, that stretched across galaxies, across dimensions, across boundaries that human science had not yet learned to perceive. The being's voice spoke again this time, not to Jacob alone, but to everyone gathered there, and it said that a great transformation was coming, not an apocalypse, but an awakening, that the old world built on separation and fear and scarcity was beginning to crack, that a new world built on unity and love and abundance was trying to be born, and that the labor pains would be difficult, would be frightening, would tempt many to retreat into the familiar darkness, but that those who had been called here tonight had a role to play, were being asked to be midwives to this new reality, to hold space for the transformation, to model through their lives what it meant to live with one foot in heaven and one foot on earth, to be bridges between the visible and invisible worlds. Jacob felt the weight of this responsibility settle onto his shoulders, and instead of feeling crushed by it, he felt oddly strengthened, as if the burden itself was a gift, as if being trusted with something difficult was a form of love. And he thought about his farm, about his fields that lay fallow each winter, only to explode with life each spring. And he understood that sometimes things needed to die, needed to be broken down into soil, into darkness, into waiting, before they could be reborn into something new. The light from the structure began to dim, and the beings started moving back toward it one by one, pausing to place hands on shoulders, or foreheads or hearts, leaving behind what felt like blessings, like benedictions, like whispered promises that this was not an ending but a beginning. And when the last of them had disappeared back through that mercurial wall, the structure itself began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then simply not there anymore, as if it had never existed at all. Though the warmth it left behind lingered in the air like a held breath, the people in the clearing stood in silence, looking at one another with new eyes, seeing not strangers, but fellow travelers, fellow pilgrims who had been to the mountaintop together and could never quite explain to those who hadn't been there what the view had been like. And slowly, without discussion, without planning, they began to move toward each other, to embrace, to weep, to laugh, to whisper fragmentary attempts at articulating the ineffable, knowing, even as they spoke, that words were insufficient. That language was too small to hold what they'd experienced, but needing to try anyway, needing to affirm to one another that yes, it had been real, yes, it had happened, yes, they were forever changed. Jacob found himself holding Sandra, the waitress, while she sobbed into his shoulder, and he realized he was sobbing too, was releasing something that had been locked inside him for years, was letting go of a grief that had turned toxic from being held too tightly, and in its place he felt something new taking root, felt green shoots of hope pushing up through the frozen ground of his heart, felt the first distant warmth of a spring he'd thought would never come. The grandmother with the rosary approached him, her face luminous with joy, and she took his hand and said in a voice shaking with emotion that she'd been praying for 50 years, to understand what her faith really meant, had been saying the words every Sunday, going through the motions, doing everything right but feeling empty inside, and tonight, finally she'd felt it had been touched by it, and now she understood that all the rituals and prayers and scriptures had just been fingers pointing at the moon, and tonight she'd finally looked where they were pointing, and had seen the moon itself blazing with light. Others shared their own revelations, speaking in hushed, rapid voices. The mechanic said he'd been ready to end his life, had driven to the hardware store that very afternoon to buy rope, and had felt the pull to come here instead. And now he understood. He was meant to stay, meant to serve, meant to be part of something larger than his own pain. The young man said he'd seen his future, had seen himself as an old man surrounded by grandchildren, telling them stories about the night he met angels in the forest and how that night had set the course for everything that followed. Everyone had received something unique, something perfectly calibrated to their needs, and yet all the messages seemed to spiral around the same core truth, that love was real, that consciousness survived death, that the universe was not random or meaningless, but shot through with purpose, and that humanity was on the cusp of remembering something. It had forgotten something about its true nature and its cosmic destiny. Eventually the group began to move as one back toward the forest's edge, back toward their vehicles and homes and lives that would never quite fit the same way again. And as they walked, Jacob noticed that the forest seemed different, now seemed more alive, more present, as if every tree and stone and blade of grass was conscious and aware and participating in some vast, intricate dance whose choreography stretched back to the beginning of time and forward to its end. When they reached the place where the woods met the fields, the group paused and someone suggested they meet again. Same place, same time in 1 month, and everyone agreed, exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, making promises to stay in touch, to support one another through whatever came next, knowing that they would need each other in the days ahead, would need to remind one another that what had happened had been real, when the world tried to convince them it had been a dream or delusion or mass hallucination. Jacob walked back to his farmhouse alone, the sky now showing the first pale hints of dawn along the eastern horizon, and when he stepped through his front door, the house that had felt like a tomb for 3 years felt different, felt lighter, felt like a place where life might bloom again. And he walked to his bedroom and knelt beside the bed, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he prayed not with words, but with his whole being, simply opening himself like a flower opens to the sun, simply saying yes to whatever came next, simply trusting that the beings of light had been telling the truth, that death was not the end, that love persisted beyond the dissolution of the body, that he would see Sarah again, not in some distant, cloudy afterlife, but in a reality more real than the one he currently inhabited, a reality that was always present, always available to those who learned how to shift their perception, how to see with new eyes. The days that followed were strange. Jacob went through the motions of farm life, feeding animals, checking fences, repairing equipment, but he did so with a lightness he hadn't felt in years, as if gravity had loosened its grip, as if the burdens he'd been carrying had been redistributed across stronger shoulders, and people began to notice his daughter, who lived 3 counties away and rarely called, drove out to visit, and commented that he seemed different, seemed more like his old self, and he almost told her about the clearing, about the beings, about the message, but something held him back, some intuition that the truth needed to be lived before it could be spoken, that he needed to embody the transformation before he tried to explain it. He attended the monthly gatherings in the clearing, and though the beings never appeared again in physical form, their presence could be felt like a warmth in the air, like a frequency that hummed just below the threshold of hearing, and the group grew as people brought friends, brought family members, brought anyone who seemed ready to hear, though they quickly learned that not everyone could feel what they felt, that some people would stand in that clearing and experience nothing but a pleasant walk in the woods while others would fall to their knees weeping. would see lights, would hear voices, would return home, fundamentally altered. Jacob began to notice synchronicities appearing in his life, would think of someone he hadn't spoken to in years, and they would call that afternoon, would wonder about a question, and would overhear a conversation that, provided the answer, would need help with something, and a stranger would appear offering exactly what was required, as if the universe was responding to his thoughts, as if reality itself was more fluid, more cooperative than he'd been taught to believe, and he remembered the beings, saying that the boundary between human and divine was permeable, and he began to understand what they meant, began to realize that miracles weren't violations of natural law, but collaborations with it, expressions of a deeper, more fundamental law that operated on principles of consciousness and intention and love. His faith, which had been withering like an unwatered plant, began to bloom again, but it was a different faith now. Not the rigid doctrinal certainty of his youth, but something more flexible, more expansive, a faith that could hold paradox and uncertainty, could embrace mystery without needing to solve it, could say, "I don't understand, but I trust," could look at the cross and the spacecraft and see not contradictions, but different expressions of the same underlying truth that the infinite cared about. The finite, that the eternal had entered time, that God, or whatever name one chose to use for that vast loving consciousness, had never been distant, had never been silent, had been speaking all along in 1,000 different languages, through 1,000 different messengers, and humanity's great error had been to mistake the messenger for the message, to build walls around particular expressions of truth and declare everything outside those walls to be false. Winter came, and Jacob's fields lay dormant under frost and snow, and he thought about death and resurrection, about the seeds sleeping in the frozen earth, holding within themselves the memory and promise of spring, and he thought about Sarah's body in the cemetery, holding within itself the memory and promise of Sarah herself, who had not ceased to exist, but had simply changed form, had been planted like a seed in the dark soil of death, and was even now growing into something new, something more, radiant, something that would bloom in a garden whose boundaries extended beyond space and time. On Christmas Eve, he attended the candlelight service at his grandfather's old church, a tradition he'd maintained even through the darkest days of his grief, and as he sat in the worn wooden pew, listening to the familiar carols, watching the candles flicker in the darkness, he felt a presence settle beside him, felt Sarah's hand slip into his, not physically, but unmistakably, and he heard her voice, not in his ears, but in his heart, saying that she was well, was more than well, was learning and growing, and waiting, and that death had been not a wall but a doorway, not an ending but a graduation, and that everything they'd built together, all the love, all the memories, all the ways they'd shaped each other's souls, had not been erased but had been preserved, was eternal, was woven into the structure of reality itself, and would never be lost. Tears rolled down Jacob's face, and the woman sitting next to him offered him a tissue and smiled kindly, and he thought about how the smallest gestures of compassion were also expressions of the divine, were also miracles, were also proof that heaven wasn't somewhere else, wasn't something that happened after death, but was right here, right now, available in every moment to anyone who learned to see it. When he returned home that night, he found an envelope tucked into his screen door. No address, no stamp, no marking of any kind, and inside was a single piece of paper with words written in elegant flowing script that said, "The time is coming when the veil will thin. When more people will see as you have seen, when the barriers between worlds will become permeable, when heaven and earth will kiss, and those who have prepared themselves, who have done the inner work, who have learned to live with open hearts will serve as guides, will help others navigate the transition, will be lights in the darkness, and you, Jacob Mercer, have been prepared. Your grief has refined you, your doubt has strengthened you, your willingness to say yes has qualified you, and we will be with you, always watching, guiding, speaking through the synchronicities and the dreams, and the quiet voice of intuition that you are learning to trust." And he knew without question that the message had come from them, from the beings of light, from the cosmic family that humanity was just beginning to remember. The years that followed were not easy. The world seemed to be accelerating towards some unknown destination. Systems that had appeared stable began to crack open. Injustice that had been hidden became visible. Fear and division intensified, as if humanity was being forced to confront everything it had been avoiding, to lance every infected wound, to drag every shadow into the light. And Jacob understood that this was necessary, was part of the transformation, was the darkness before dawn, and he did his best to be a steady presence in his community, to model calm in the midst of chaos, to offer kindness when everyone else was offering judgment, to speak truth when everyone else was speaking fear. Part 2. The gathering in the clearing continued month after month, year after year, the original group of 24 growing to 50, then 100, then spreading to other locations as people carried the experience back to their own communities, back to their own forests and fields. And someone started a website, and someone else wrote a book, and the story began to spread, not through any organized effort, but organically, like mycelium threading through soil, like roots seeking water, like seeds, scattered by wind finding purchase in fertile ground. And Jacob, who had always been a private man, found himself being interviewed, being asked to speak at conferences, being invited to share his experience with groups of seekers and skeptics and scholars. And though part of him wanted to retreat back into the simplicity of farm life, another part understood that this was his purpose, was what he'd been prepared for, was his way of serving the great transformation that the beings had spoken about. He learned to tell his story simply, without embellishment, without trying to convince anyone of anything, just offering his truth and trusting that those who were ready to hear would hear, and those who weren't wouldn't, and that both responses were perfect, were exactly as they should be. And he learned that the miracle wasn't in the spectacular encounter in the clearing, though that had been profound beyond measure, but in the small daily choices to live with an open heart, to see the sacred in the ordinary, to treat every interaction as an opportunity to express love, to recognize the divine spark in every person he met, even and especially in those who seemed most lost, most broken, most opposed to everything he believed. Sandra, the waitress, became one of his closest friends. She quit her job and went back to school to study theology, but found herself frustrated by the rigidity of academic religion, by the way scholars dissected mystery until it died, by the way institutions built walls around truth and tried to control access to it. And eventually she left and started her own ministry of sorts, serving food to the homeless and sitting with the dying and offering presents without agenda. And she told Jacob that she'd learned more about God in those raw, unguarded moments than she'd ever learned in a classroom. And he understood exactly what she meant, because he too had discovered that the divine revealed itself most clearly, not in doctrines or dogmas, but in the messy, beautiful, terrible, precious moments of actual human life. The mechanic, whose name was Thomas, started a support group for men struggling with depression and addiction, and he never mentioned the beings or the clearing in his meetings, but everything he shared was infused with what he'd learned that night about the value of each soul, about the possibility of transformation, about the reality of love as a force more powerful than gravity, more fundamental than the electromagnetic force, more persistent than entropy. And men who came to his meetings broken and hopeless left with something rekindled in their eyes, left believing that maybe they deserved to be alive, deserved to take up space, deserved to be loved, not because they'd earned it, but because love was their birthright, was woven into the fabric of their being, was as intrinsic to their nature as breath. The grandmother, whose name was Rose, lived only 2 more years after that night in the clearing, but those 2 years were, according to her daughter, the most joyful of her entire life. She seemed to glow with an inner light, seemed unafraid of the death she knew was approaching, seemed eager even to discover what waited on the other side, and when she finally passed, she did so with a smile on her face, and her final words were, "I see them. I see the lights, they've come to take me home." And everyone in the room felt a presence, felt a warmth, felt the unmistakable sense that Rose was not disappearing, but graduating, was not ending, but continuing, was not dying, but being born into something larger and more radiant than anything the physical world could contain. Jacob thought often about the message the beings had given, about the great transformation, about humanity's awakening, about the old world crumbling and the new world being born, and he saw evidence of it everywhere. Saw young people refusing to accept the systems and stories their parents had believed, saw movements for justice and equality and environmental healing gaining momentum, saw technology connecting people across vast distances, allowing ideas to spread at the speed of light, saw scientific discoveries that seemed to confirm what mystics had been saying for millennia, that consciousness was fundamental, that the universe was interconnected, that the observer and the observed were not separate, but aspects of a larger unified whole. And he saw resistance too, saw fear and anger, and desperate attempts to cling to the old ways, saw violence erupting as systems fought to preserve themselves, saw propaganda and manipulation, and lies being wielded as weapons, and he understood that this too was part of the process. Was the death throes of a paradigm that had outlived its usefulness, was painful, but necessary, was the only way humanity could move forward into its next chapter. He began to have dreams, vivid and luminous dreams, in which he walked through landscapes that existed nowhere on earth, through cities of crystal and light, through gardens where the flowers sang and the trees spoke wisdom, through halls of learning, where beings from countless worlds gathered to share knowledge, to solve problems, to support one another's evolution. And in these dreams he would encounter Sarah, would hold her hand, would walk with her through impossible beauty, and she would tell him things, would share secrets about the nature of reality, about the structure of consciousness, about the destiny of the human race. And when he woke, he could never quite remember. The specifics could never quite capture the details, but the essence remained imprinted on his soul, like a fragrance that lingered long after the flower had been removed. On the 5th anniversary of that first night in the clearing, the group gathered as always at midnight, but this time something was different. This time the air crackled with energy. This time the stars seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats, and as they stood in a circle holding hands, the structure appeared again, rising from the ground, or descending from the sky, or materializing from some dimension that intersected with their own, and the beings emerged, 12 of them this time, and they moved to the center of the circle, and the tallest one spoke not in words but in pure meaning, that downloaded directly into consciousness, and it said that the time had come, that the great work was beginning, that humanity stood at a threshold and could choose to step through into a future of unimaginable beauty and possibility, or could choose to retreat into fear and separation and extinction, and that the choice would not be made by governments or corporations or institutions, but by individuals, by billions of individual souls deciding moment by moment whether to choose love or fear, courage or comfort, growth or stagnation. It said that those gathered here, and thousands like them in clearings and churches and temples and living rooms around the world, had volunteered before being born, had agreed to come to Earth during this pivotal time, had accepted the mission of being way showers, of demonstrating through their lives what it meant to live as both human and divine, as both individual and universal, as both mortal and eternal, and that the work was difficult, was often lonely, was frequently thankless, but was also sacred, was essential, was the most important work being done anywhere in the galaxy, because Earth was a crucial node in the cosmic web, because what happened here would ripple outward, affecting civilizations on thousands of worlds, because humanity, despite its youth, despite its mistakes, despite its violence and ignorance, possessed something rare and precious, a capacity for rapid transformation, an ability to make quantum leaps in consciousness, a potential that, when finally realized, would allow it to take its place among the elder races and contribute its unique gifts to the great symphony of creation. The being said that the return of the Christ consciousness, the second coming that so many religions anticipated, was not about a single individual descending from the clouds, but about humanity as a whole, awakening to its divine nature, was about every person remembering what Jesus and Buddha and Krishna and countless other masters had tried to teach, that the kingdom of heaven was within that separation, was an illusion, that love was the fundamental force of the universe, and that each person contained within themselves the same creative power, the same connection to source, the same capacity for miracles that the great teachers had demonstrated, and that this awakening was happening now, was accelerating, was why the old systems were collapsing, was why everything seemed to be intensifying, was why people everywhere were experiencing spontaneous spiritual openings, were seeing visions, were hearing voices, were having encounters like the one this group had experienced 5 years ago. It said that the beings who had been watching humanity for millennia, who had been appearing in various forms throughout history, as angels, as gods, as visitors from the stars, were now revealing themselves more openly, because humanity was ready, was reaching a level of maturity where it could handle the truth, could accept that it was not alone, could understand that the universe was not a dead mechanical thing but a living conscious entity, and that every planet, every star, every galaxy was an expression of the same infinite intelligence that humans called God, but that had countless other names and ultimately no name at all, because it was too vast, too complete, too fundamental to be captured by language. The being extended its hands, and light poured from its palms, light that washed over the gathered humans, and as it touched them they gasped, they wept, they fell to their knees or threw their heads back in ecstasy, and Jacob felt the light enter through his crown and flow down through his body, igniting every cell, awakening capacities that had been dormant, unlocking memories that stretched back before his birth, back through previous lifetimes, back to the moment when his individual soul had first separated from the ocean of consciousness and had begun its long journey through form, and he saw that journey, saw himself as a being of pure light, choosing to incarnate, choosing to forget who he was, choosing to experience limitation and suffering and death, because only through that forgetting, through that limitation, could he truly appreciate reunion, could he truly understand the magnitude of love, could he truly comprehend the miracle of existence. And he saw that every difficult moment in his life, every loss, every betrayal, every disappointment had been part of the curriculum, had been exactly what his soul needed to grow, to expand, to become capable of holding more light, more love, more truth. He saw Sarah's death not as a tragedy, but as an agreement they'd made before being born, saw that she had loved him enough to leave him, to break his heart so completely that it could never quite close again, and through that permanent opening grace could flow, and he understood that grief was not something to be gotten over or moved past, but something to be honored, to be integrated, to be recognized as love's signature, as proof that connection persisted beyond physical presence. And he felt overwhelming gratitude for every moment of pain, because he could see now how each one had been a chisel strike, shaping him, sculpting him, transforming him from rough stone into something that could catch and reflect the light. The vision faded, and Jacob found himself on his hands and knees in the grass, gasping for air, his entire body trembling, and all around him others were having similar experiences, were being shown their own journeys, their own purposes, their own perfect place in the intricate web of existence, and slowly they began to recover, to sit up, to look at each other, with eyes that had been washed clean, with faces that had been made new, and the beings told them that they would not appear again in this way, that this was a graduation, that the training wheels were coming off, that humanity needed to learn to walk on its own, to trust its own connection to source, to stop looking to external authorities, whether religious or governmental or extraterrestrial, and start listening to the still small voice within that never lied, that always knew the way home, and that this didn't mean the beings were abandoning humanity, but rather that they were stepping back to allow it to claim its full power, to accept its full responsibility to become the magnificent species it had always been destined to become. The beings began to fade, their forms becoming transparent, their light dimming, and the tallest one spoke a final message that echoed in every heart present, saying, "Remember who you are, remember why you came, remember that you are not victims of circumstance, but creators of reality, not powerless individuals, but nodes of infinite consciousness, not separate from the divine, but expressions of it. And when the darkness seems overwhelming, when the transformation seems too difficult, when you doubt, everything you've learned here tonight, remember this moment, remember this feeling, remember that you are loved beyond measure, beyond comprehension, beyond anything your human mind can grasp, and that love will never abandon. You will never fail. You will carry you through whatever comes, and will ultimately deliver you home." And then they were gone, and the structure dissolved, and the clearing was once again just a clearing, just a circle of grass under an ocean of stars, but nothing would ever be just anything again, because the people gathered there had been fundamentally altered, had been rewired at the level of soul, had been given a mission and a purpose and a promise that would sustain them through all the trials ahead. In the years that followed, the world did indeed transform. There were upheavals and revelations and crises that shook every institution to its foundations. There were natural disasters and economic collapses and political chaos. There were moments when it seemed like everything was falling apart, when civilization itself seemed on the verge of extinction. But there were also miracles. There were spontaneous healings and impossible synchronicities and moments of collective grace when strangers helped. Strangers, when communities came together, when people chose love over fear again and again and again, and slowly, gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape that had known only night, the new world began to emerge, began to take shape, began to reveal itself. And those who had been prepared, those who had done the inner work, those who had said yes to the transformation, found themselves in positions of influence, found themselves being sought out for guidance, found themselves serving as bridges between the old paradigm in the new. Jacob lived to be 87 years old and spent his final decades traveling and teaching and writing and farming, and above all living as a testament to the truth that ordinary people could have extraordinary experiences, that heaven and earth were not separate, that consciousness survived death, that love was real, was fundamental, was the force that held galaxies together and broke hearts open and healed wounds and transformed species. And he never claimed to have all the answers, never presented himself as a guru or a saint, but simply as a man who had been broken by grief and remade by grace, who had been lost in darkness and found by light, who had encountered the impossible and been forever changed by it. On his final day, as he lay in his own bed in the farmhouse, where he'd lived his entire life surrounded by his daughter and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and friends and students and fellow travelers from that first night in the clearing, he smiled and said the same words Rose had said decades before: "I see them. I see the lights," and everyone in the room felt. It felt the presence of the beings felt. Sarah, standing at the foot of the bed waiting to take her husband's hand, felt the veil thin. To transparency felt the boundaries dissolve, and as Jacob took his final breath, there was no sense of ending, only of continuation, only of graduation, only of a beloved soul moving from one room to another in a house that had infinitely many rooms and infinitely many doors, and the grief his loved ones felt was real and deep and piercing, but it was shot through with joy, was illuminated by certainty, was held in the container of knowing that death was not the end, that they would see him again, that love persisted, that consciousness was eternal, that everything the beings had said was true. The farm passed to his daughter, who maintained the fields and the house and opened the property to the public, offering retreats and workshops and gatherings where people could come to hear the stories, could stand in the clearing, could feel for themselves the presence that lingered there. And year after year, decade after decade, people came seeking and sometimes finding, seeking answers and sometimes finding better questions, seeking proof and sometimes finding something more valuable than proof, finding experience, finding transformation, finding that crack in consensus reality through which grace could enter. And the story spread, became legend, became myth, became one of countless stories around the world about ordinary people having extraordinary encounters about the boundaries between heaven and earth, growing thin about the great awakening, the great transformation, the great return, and whether people believed the stories were literally true or metaphorically true or simply beautiful. Fiction didn't matter as much as what the stories did to those who heard them, how they opened hearts, how they planted seeds, how they gave permission for mystery and wonder and possibility. Decades after Jacob's death, a young woman who had grown up hearing the stories made a pilgrimage to the farm and stood alone in the clearing at midnight on the anniversary of that first gathering, and she didn't see any beings, didn't see any structures, didn't see anything but trees and stars, and yet she felt something, felt a presence, felt a warmth, felt a voice, not in her ears but in her heart, saying that she too was called, was chosen, was loved, and she returned home and quit her job. That was making her miserable, and started a non-profit serving refugees, and discovered a joy and purpose she'd never imagined possible. And she told her friends about the feeling in the clearing, and some of them laughed, and some of them were intrigued, and one of them decided to make his own pilgrimage and had his own experience, and the ripples continued spreading outward, touching lives, transforming hearts, opening minds, generation after generation, each one taking up the work where the previous had left off. Each one adding their own verse to the poem, each one discovering that the story had never been about Jacob or Sandra or Thomas or Rose, but about something larger, about the human journey from separation to unity, from unconsciousness to awakening, from fear to love. Perhaps the beings had never been extraterrestrial at all. Perhaps they had been angels. Perhaps they had been projections of collective consciousness. Perhaps they had been exactly what they appeared to be, visitors from distant worlds. Perhaps the truth was stranger and more complex than any single explanation could capture. Perhaps it didn't matter, because the real miracle had never been the beings themselves, but what they revealed, what they awakened, what they made possible, the understanding that existence was not random, that consciousness was not accidental, that every person contained multitudes, contained divinity, contained the seeds of transformation that could, when properly nurtured, bloom into something magnificent. The night wind moves through the Kentucky hills, carrying the scent of turned earth and growing things, carrying the sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures, carrying the memory of an old farmer who once stood in a clearing and had his world unmade and remade, carrying the promise that what happened to him could happen to anyone, could happen to you if you're willing to say yes, if you're brave enough to follow that strange pull in your chest into the dark woods, if you're open enough to stand in, or before mystery, without demanding explanation. The invitation is always present. The call is always being issued. The beings of light or angels, or however you choose to name that which is greater than yourself, are always watching, always waiting, always ready to meet you in the clearing, in the silence, in the space between heartbeats, where the impossible becomes possible and the boundary between heaven and earth dissolves like morning mist. Truth or fiction, maybe the teller himself doesn't know for certain. Here these stories exist to touch you, to make you reflect. The magical reveals itself only to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on searching for certainties. What remains is not proof but possibility, not answers but wonder, not certainty but faith, the kind of faith that doesn't require evidence because it's built on experience, built on that moment when everything you thought you knew crumbled and something truer took its place. And maybe that's enough, maybe that's everything. Maybe that's what we're all searching for in the end. Not proof of God or aliens or life after death, but permission to believe that we're part of something larger, something sacred, something that holds us even when we're falling, especially when we're falling, and whispers in a voice that sounds like wind through trees, like stars singing, like silence speaking, that we are loved, that we are known, that we are never, ever alone.